text this morning is in Matthew chapter 9, verses 18 through 26. And it states the following. It says, as Jesus was saying this, the leader of the synagogue came and knelt before him. My daughter has just died, he said, but you can bring her back to life again if you just come and lay your hand on her. So Jesus and his disciples got up and went with him. Just then, a woman who had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding came up behind him. She touched the fringe of his robe, for she thought, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, he said, daughter, be encouraged. Your faith has made you well. And the woman was healed at that moment. Pretty wonderful and amazing story. But have you ever listened to like 3 different people that were a part of the story tell that same story? It's amazing how different people will tell stories. And when I looked at this, and I looked at this story is recorded in Mark 5 and Luke 8 also. And it was amazing when I looked at this, Matthew really just gave the synopsis. Guy came, needed his daughter healed. Some lady snuck up behind him, touched him, boom, she was healed. That's pretty much all that you get out of that. So this morning I was wanting to maybe look at a little more detailed account of what actually took place, because I think the details in this particular instance are important. So I wanted to look at Mark's version of the story, and here's how it goes. It starts in Mark 5, starting with verse 24, and goes through verse 36. Verse 24 says, Jesus went with him, and the guy's name, by the way, is Jairus, that Mark had actually already told us the guy's name. But it says, Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. Okay, so Jesus wasn't just like walking along the road with 5 or 10 people. He had crowds of probably close to 1,000 people, or at least several hundred people crushing in around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. Verse 26, she had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. Basically, she had tried everything in her power to get better. And if you study any of the accounts of what doctoring was back in those days, especially with the issue of bleeding that she was having, it was probably horrific, the things that she went through at the hands of the doctors that were supposed to be healing her to get to this point. Not only had she gone through unbelievable physical trauma, undoubtedly, but she had also spent every last penny she had. She had come to the end, and she had tried everything within her power to get this whole thing dealt with. And not only that, something that we wouldn't really get in our culture, she was an outcast. The same way a leper would have to go around saying, unclean, unclean, and walk around to the other side of the street. She wasn't allowed to have personal contact. If she touched something, it would be dirty for 7 days before you could use it again. She basically walked around like a leper for 12 years, trying everything she could to get better. She was sick, she was an outcast, and she was desperate. When she heard about, in verse 27, she had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. And I thought about this. She's been bleeding for 12 years. She's basically in this essentially weakened state. She's lightheaded, probably dizzy. She probably has headaches. She's probably got issues with her physical ability. And I don't know if any of you have ever lost a lot of blood, or you get probably the same effect from fasting. Or in my case, being an idiot and running 50 miles, you don't have a lot of physical capacity at that point. She literally fought through this crowd. She pushed her way through. She fought, she pressed, she moved, she was shoving people aside. This weak, it was a difficult task for her just to stand there, let alone to fight through what she had to fight through to get there. So she pushed through and touched him. She thought, if I can just touch his robe, I can get healed. Oh, verse 28 says the same thing. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. Verse 29, immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel her body, or in her body, that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my robe? And the disciples looked at him and said, look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, who touched me? It's kind of funny. It's like this dude with, like, I don't know, you name some rock star or whatever, and they're walking through a crowd, and everybody's reaching out trying to touch them and grab their clothes or whatever, or just touch them, whatever the deal is. And he's got thousands of them, and he stops and he says, whoa, wait, somebody touched me. Can you imagine the disciples looking at him like, you have just lost your mind. It's like, hey, who touched me? Verse 32. But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said, daughter, your faith has made you well. And I love this. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. Go in peace. With all that she had been through, all the pain, all the rejection, all of the unclean, and walking at the other side of the street, not being able to hang out with friends, not having any of that, in one fell swoop, one touch, it was all gone. But she had to push through to get there. And I think sometimes in our lives we're dying to hear, go in peace, your suffering is over. But I also think so many times in our lives we just come up with excuse after excuse after excuse why I can't press in and finally take hold of God and finally get that freedom. We think of excuse after excuse after excuse, and consequently we never make it there. There's too many people, Lord. I'm weak, Lord. I don't feel good today, Lord. But the answer is with him. Go in peace, your suffering is over. Verse 35, while he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now. I thought about that. What a strange juxtaposition. Here's Jairus. His hope is in Jesus, that Jesus is going to come and lay hands on his daughter and heal her, because that's what he does. He's been doing that all over the countryside. And so that's his one hope. And he watches a lady get healed right in front of him. And he hears, go in peace, your suffering is over. And he's like, yes, yes, that's about to take place with my daughter. And right in that moment, like right after, go in peace, your suffering is over, somebody walks up. While this conversation is still going on, and says, there's no use troubling the teacher now, your daughter is dead. What a horrible, crushing message for him. And here's the thing, you got to understand, for this guy to even get there to talk to Jesus, that was a big deal. We're talking about pushing through and pushing on. This guy, for him to go and talk to Jesus, he was the leader of the synagogue. Guess who were the power brokers in the synagogue? The Pharisees and the Sadducees. The religious leaders that eventually ended up killing Jesus. The guys that hated Jesus were the power brokers where he was the leader. He basically knew, when he walked out his door that morning, he knew that he pretty much sacrificed everything that he had given his life to in achieving esteem and achieving just all of his achievements, essentially, were all summed up in this one moment. He was walking out the door. And I'm guessing his wife probably kicked him out the door and made him go. Who knows? But he's got all of that on the line, and somebody comes up and says, too late. He had to have been crushed at that moment. But verse 36 says, but Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, don't be afraid, just have faith. And I thought about that. Don't be afraid, just have faith. And I think some of us probably here this morning, some of you probably need to hear that. Somebody probably walked through the door this morning and they just feel like the guys on there, that no matter what they do, they're getting knocked in the water. No matter what they do, they can't overcome their obstacles. Jesus is the perfection of hope. He says, don't be afraid, just have faith. It's never over with Jesus until he says it's over. It's never over with God until he says it's over. He has the final say. He does reign. He reigns over absolutely everything. So until he says we're done, we're not done. I'm jumping back to Matthew chapter 9, going to verse 23. It says, when Jesus arrived at the official's home, he saw the noisy crowd and heard the funeral music. Get out, he told them. The girl isn't dead, she's only asleep. But the crowd laughed at him. According to the King James, it says they laughed him to scorn. In other words, they had a good old time laughing at the Son of God because he told them that she wasn't dead, that she was only asleep. And here's the thing, I thought about this and I thought, according to the book of John, Jesus only did and said what God the Father had told him to do and say. And he got laughed to scorn. Then I considered, how is it that God is willing to be laughed to scorn for us? This is a sidebar completely. But how is it that the Son of God is willing to be laughed to scorn for us? But we're often so afraid of what someone will think if we talk about him. If we do what God says to do, if we obey God the way Jesus, we're so afraid. I thought about it and I thought, if folks aren't laughing at you because you're doing what God says to do, maybe we've missed what the whole Christian thing means. Christian means Christ-like. And to be like Christ, he was persecuted because he did what God said to do. He was laughed at because he did what God said to do. And I thought, are we so politically correct that we are missing what it means to be Christian? Are the policies at our work, are the policies with our nation, are the policies or the unspoken code of conduct with political correctness? Have we so bought into that we are no longer obeying what God says to do? Just food for thought. Next it says, after the crowd was put outside, however, Jesus went in and took the girl by the hand and she stood up. And I just want to do another real quick sidebar. Sometimes some people need to be put outside for God to do anything. Sometimes it's a situation where if God is really going to do what God wants to do, some people have to be put outside. And I thought about that. I thought sometimes in our lives, for God to do what God wants to do, what He needs to do, what He's in the process of doing, sometimes there's some people that can't be in the room. Sometimes we have to make way for God to work, and part of that sometimes is removing people in our life that keep God from having the freedom to move. So I went in and took the girl by the hand, and she stood up. The report of this miracle swept through the entire countryside. Now, a couple of things that we need to hear today. First, I think we as a people need to hear, "Go in peace, your suffering is over." I think we need to hear, "Don't be afraid, just have faith." Because undoubtedly some of us are dealing with things that are difficult. Some of us need the encouragement to say, "God's got me." Will this week, I was talking about some tax bills that we had from a mistake in the way that we originally set up the church's payroll system, and my housing allowance did not go in the right way on my W-2, and so I had a big tax burden. And it's come back, and I wrote out the last check this past week, and we were discussing it, and Will walks over to me, and he says, "It's okay, Daddy. God will take care of you." I was like, and I preach that all the time. My poor wife hates hearing me say that. And I now know why. Will came over and said, and I'm like, "Oh, he's right. He's so right." Because God always, always, always has us. Don't be afraid, just have faith. And I thought Psalm 8:2, "Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings, thou hast ordained strength." And I just thought, man, out of the mouth of babes, it's true. It's okay, Daddy. God will take care of you. And He does. He's got you. He's got you completely. No matter what your situation, no matter how bleak, no matter how dark, no matter how horrible, God always, if you're His and you are doing what He says to do, He always has our back. Always. Come what may. So as I looked at the stories today, I asked, what were the common precursors? What were the common prerequisites? What did God have to have in place? Or what did He put in place before He did these miracles? And I thought about it for a while. I thought, a couple things. First thing is these people took action. For God to do stuff in our lives, believe it or not, most of the time, it requires something on our part. I mean, these people first exhausted their resources. In other words, they tried everything they could do. They finally got to the point where they realized they had to have God step in. I mean, this poor woman, she had, again, unbearable suffering that she went through, and had spent the very last of her resources, her money, on getting well. She couldn't do it. She took action. And then secondly, once they realized that they had exhausted all that they could do, they then went and they exhausted the last of their strength, the last of their, credibility for Jairus. Reputation, etc. They exhausted what they had. They took action to get to Jesus. They fought through to get to Jesus. Jairus had to fight through his unbelief the moment they came and said. He had to fight through that heart that literally sank down to the ground when the person walked in. Right after he heard the "Go in peace, your suffering is over," right after that he hears, she's dead. So they expended all they had to get to Jesus, to find Jesus. And that poor woman had to push through in a weakened and broken down state. She had to push through a crowd of maybe 1,000 people. If you've ever tried that, that's not a pretty sight. The second thing I thought is, not only did they have to take action and do all that they could do, and then realize, okay, I can't do it, now I have to get to God. They also come to a point of desperation. A desperation that is so dramatic they are willing to accept humiliation. A lot of people call themselves desperate, but they're not really desperate. Desperation to the point of a willingness to accept humiliation. The woman was unclean. She should never have been in that crowd. Had they known, they would have run her out of Dodge. And Jairus was going to be rejected by his friends and those who looked up to him and admired him, and he was definitely going to end up losing his position. They were willing to accept humiliation to get to God. A third thing that I found was belief. They believed that Jesus could do it. They believed it so much they were willing to suffer the humiliation. They were willing to fight through. They were willing to push in and press in till they got to him. You have to have faith enough to act on it. You have to have faith enough to risk humiliation. And you have to have faith enough to, regardless of the obstacles, overcome them. And finally, there's a determination to fight through the obstacles. It's not just a faith, it's a determination. Because a lot of times, it won't come easy. If it's important enough, you push, you shove, and you fight through, even when you're weak. I thought about this and I thought, what if one of my kids was in the middle of a crowd being hurt by a bully? Wouldn't matter how big that crowd was. As I'm saying, excuse me, crowd folk would be flying through the air. As I, quote, made my way through. And I don't care how big the bully was. Mamas, you all know this is true. Could be Samson when you got through there. You wouldn't care. You'd be in there. You'd be on the guy. I know how mamas are. Mama bear, get out of the way. If it's important enough, you fight through. Whatever it is. Your desire and your desperation, I realize, depends on the level, or will determine, the level of your push. Sometimes I think that we don't have great desperation. I feel like that is probably our biggest, it's one of the biggest reasons we don't have a lot of miracles take place anymore. We have so much provided for us. We have so much given. We have so much done. But I thought about it, and I thought, what do you need from God today? Do you have something that you need from God? And again, sometimes I feel like it's hard for me to totally lay hold of this, because God has so blessed my life. It's like, what do I have need from God? I don't know. He's just given me everything. More than I ever dreamed, more than I ever asked, because He said in His Word, if I followed Him, if I did what He said, if I obeyed Him and pursued Him, He would take care of all the rest, and He has. But I realize that some folks walking in today are a lot earlier in the journey than I am, because when I first came to Christ, I could not say He has provided everything. He's just blown me away year after year after year of my life. Some of you guys are in an earlier place, or maybe things have just gotten hard for whatever reason. Maybe God just wants to display His glory in your life. But what do you have need of today? What's in the way of you getting to Jesus to get that need met? A lot of times it's humiliation. Most folks aren't desperate enough to withstand humiliation to get to Jesus. So maybe it's belief. And that might be a problem for many of us. We're just not sure that God really has the answer for our issue, our dilemma. But I want to state this, and I can say this from my life, I can say this from the Bible, I can say this from watching over and over and over again. God always has the answer. God always, always has the answer for our dilemma. And if it's not fear and humiliation, and you do believe that God has your answer, are you determined enough to push through? Are you determined enough to push through anything, any obstacle, to get to God? Are you determined to fight until you get to the other side? I love the story of the Canaanite woman who asked Jesus for healing for her daughter who's demon-possessed. I always got a kick out of this particular one. Jesus humiliates this lady. I know that sounds horrible, but that's exactly what he did. He humiliated her point blank. And he says, is it right to give children's food to the dogs? He basically, point blank in front of this huge crowd, calls her a dog. He says, is it right to give children's food to a dog? And here's what she came back with. Even dogs eat what falls under their master's table. That is a woman who really, really wanted her daughter healed. And Jesus' response was, lady, you have great faith. And he healed her daughter. What kind of determination do we have? If God doesn't do what you're asking just when you want it, do you give up? Do you quit? Do you fold? Like the parable of the unjust judge. Little old lady comes up and she starts asking this unjust judge to give her justice. And the Bible says eventually he does. And he says, I don't do it because I fear God or man. I just am sick and tired of this crazy little lady bugging me 24/7. She was relentless. When he started that parable, the section starts with that Jesus taught them this so that they would always pray and not give up. How many times do we just give up? Because it's not instantaneous. We are living in like the ultimate instantaneous era, are we not? You got your microwave, you got your USA Today. Oh, forget the USA Today. We now have Google. If you want to know something, boom. You go get it. It can be just casual conversation, whatever it is you want, whatever it is we're just used to everything being instantaneous. And it's not always like that with God. In fact, it's almost never like that with God. But that's what our actions need to look like. When it comes to seeing God's hand move, we need a relentless forward motion. We need to consistently, constantly push in. Constantly be knocking on the door. Hey, Judge, you haven't heard from me in 2 hours. Just wanted you to know I'm still out here waiting. He gave that parable so that we would know how we're supposed to pray. You never stop. You never stop praying. You never stop believing. You never stop obeying, because God always has your answer. Always. So what do I expect you to take home from this section of Scripture today? First, no matter how difficult the situation, Jesus has the answer. Second, Jesus' way is generally a lot harder than we'd like it to be. That's just an FYI, because a lot of people think Jesus' way has got to be simple. It's not. It's generally a lot harder than we think that it ought to be. In fact, I believe that that's why there's so few miracles anymore. Very seldom is a person so desperate, profoundly humble, strong in faith, and relentless in their determination. It's almost never seen. I was thinking about this and I thought, really, the only time I've seen that is mothers praying for their children. And I have seen some miraculous turnarounds in kids' lives as a result of mothers just relentlessly holding on to God, unwilling to let go. I love that about moms. Moms are they're fierce and they're unwilling to let go. Finally, if we don't give up, if we continue through anything, I want you to know God will respond. God will respond. You need to get that. He has the answer, and if you continue to push and fight, He will respond. And I want to leave you with a story this morning. I'm going to push a minute or two by, but I think it's a good story. I probably shared it with you before, some 4 or 5 years ago, for those that have been with me that long. But it's a story of Peter Richley. In October of 1829, he was a terribly grateful man. He had survived one of the strangest and most harrowing events known to mankind. The ship he had been traveling on, the Mermaid, sank. And after 3 days of huddling on a rock with the rest of the crew and the passengers, they were rescued by the Swift Shore. By another strange twist of circumstance, the Swift Shore also sank. Everyone survived, and they were rescued again by the Governor Ready. But this ship also sank. They were all then rescued for a third time by the ship Comet. Yet this fourth ship also sank 5 days later. And unbelievably, the whole of all persons from every ship was rescued yet again, this time by the Jupiter, which then proceeded to sink as well. Reality, stranger than fiction. This is real. It would have been laughable had it not been so serious, and sure enough, as if on cue, another ship came by and pulled every single person out alive. This ocean liner, called the City of Leeds, was named after its British city of origin. It was bound from England to Australia and traveled the same sea lane as Peter Richley's downed ships. The crew of the City of Leeds hoisted Peter and the others on board. Dry clothing was provided for Peter. The ship's doctor gave him a cursory exam, pronounced him fit, and then asked an unusual favor. There's a lady on board who's booked passage to Australia, the doctor explained. She's looking for her son who disappeared years ago. She's dying. She's asking to see her son. She knows everybody on board, and since you're a newcomer and seem to fit her description of her boy, would you pretend to be your son? So Peter agreed. After all, his life had been saved now 5 times, and he should do some good with it. He followed the doctor below deck and entered into a cabin. There on a small bed lay a frail woman with silvered hair. She was obviously suffering from a very high fever. Deliriously, she was crying out, "Please, God, let me see my son before I die. I must see my son." The ship's doctor gently pushed the young man toward the bed. When he saw the woman's face, he collapsed at her side and began sobbing. For there in the bed was the reason he had just experienced and survived 5 shipwrecks. Laying there was none other than Sarah Richley, his mother, who had prayed for 10 years to be reconciled to her son Peter. The ship's doctor stood in amazement as the young man wept and embraced the sick woman. "I'm here, Mom. I'm here. It's me." Within days, the fever subsided, and the mother awakened to find and answer prayer seated on the edge of her bed. And I just want to say, never stop the pursuit. God will act if you refuse to let go. Like that widow, or like that lady bleeding. We're like Jacob, who wouldn't let go of the angel until he blessed him. He will respond. Let's pray.